Welcome to day 17 of Conscious Capitalism's expanded virtual conference. It has been an absolute pleasure to be spending each day with our community members from around the world and to really soak in not only the connection and the engagement with each of you, but the joy and also some of the challenges that everybody brings to the conversations, because we are all facing very disruptive times, and our sense of shared purpose and alignment in values is what has helped our community continue to learn and grow during these times. Today, we have a very special guest joining us to be sharing with you his wisdom and the experience that he brings to the times that we are in. And I've actually had a lot of time to get to know Tim over the past year, because he is one of the very first certified conscious capitalism consultants. So I want to congratulate him once again to be one of the first to come through our program and to really be an incredible role model for other candidates in the program as well. Tim is the author of True Purpose, and he is an expert at finding organizations' higher purpose. He teaches self-organizing systems to business leaders and also serves on the board of Holacracy One. Tim's clients include ING, Oracle, Alibaba, PricewaterhouseCoopers, and Accenture. He is working to convert business from a profit-driven activity to a purpose-driven one. So Tim, welcome to our stage here at the Expanded Virtual Conference. I am excited to learn even more from you today. Take it away.
Thank you so much, Amanda. Yeah, and thanks so much for all the help with me going through the Conscious Capitalism certification program. That was great.
Absolutely.
Hey, everybody, welcome. This talk is going to be in three parts. The first part will be the talk part, where I talk. Then we'll do some Q&A, and then towards the end, I want to break up into small groups, because I really want to give people a chance to work with and take action on what we're discussing and learning in this session. And apply it to your own business, as opposed to leaving the whole thing theoretical. Because especially in a crisis, I think it's pretty important to take what you're learning about how to do stuff in a crisis and do it in real time, rather than waiting and doing it later. So John Mackey spoke last week on leading in a crisis. This talk is a little more narrowly focused. It's specifically about purpose in a crisis and how to use purpose as a leadership and strategic tool during a crisis. That's what we're going to be talking about today. So if you've been paying attention and attending other conscious capitalism events, reading books and such like that, then you know that purpose-driven companies outperform the market about 15-1. And purpose-driven companies have greater brand loyalty. Purpose-driven employees are more engaged. Purpose-driven employees are more productive. They have lower turnover, fewer lost work days. The question, though, is what happens to all of that when the company's survival is on the line? Because this causes people to start to think differently when they're looking at the impending destruction of their company. So does purpose have a role in a crisis? And if so, what is the role of purpose in a crisis? So I'm going to answer that question a couple of different ways. But before I do, I want to actually talk a little bit about how people behave in a crisis, as opposed to how companies behave in a crisis, because companies' decisions are made by people. And so we're going to do a little bit of brief brain science here. So let me share my screen. Let's see, where's the share screen button? There it is, share screen. And we're going to share that. And then start a slideshow like that. And there, can everybody see Maslow there? Give me a thumbs up if you can see our buddy Maslow. Excellent. So there's our buddy Maslow, and there's his pyramid, which we all know and love. Now, you may notice this pyramid has an extra layer on top of it. The last few years of Maslow's life, he postulated several different additional layers. And one of them was this one called self-transcendence. So the lower ones, self-esteem, belonging, community, love, safety and security, physiological, those are probably easy to understand and well known for you. Self-actualization, think of as be all you can be, right? The Army motto, meaning that your gifts are being fully expressed. And self-transcendence has to do with a focus on the needs of others. And it takes a couple different forms. And he wrote about this, but it was never, I don't know that it was fully published while he was still alive, which is one way of looking at it is my own needs are really well met. And now I start to think about the needs of others. So think of it in terms of philanthropy. But another way to think of this is actually as an erosion of the boundary between self and other. That sense that we're all connected, or a connection to something larger, something like that. So that also, according to his writings, is a feature of this self-transcendence need. Remember, this is a hierarchy of needs. So this is a need to be part of something larger, a need to be connected to others, a need to focus on the needs of others and not only on the needs of self. So if you think about purpose, purpose actually lives at the top two levels. One being, I use my purpose to fully express my gifts, to be all I can be, to have the maximum positive impact of which I'm capable. But I also use my purpose to serve the needs of others and create a better world, and honor the fact that I'm connected to something larger, and do that honoring through the act of doing my purpose. So purpose is in both of those. And when we're dealing with a crisis where people are dying and hospitals are overflowing and companies are shutting down, that's going to stimulate the bottom two layers: safety, security, and physiological needs. Where do I get my food? Am I going to have a house? Is my family going to be safe? That kind of stuff. So we have this competition between the top two layers, purpose needs, and the bottom two layers, survival needs, stimulated by the crisis. And as we all know, the way Maslow's hierarchy works is the lower needs get priority over the higher ones. Now, it's not quite that simple, though. They've done studies and they've shown that people can process multiple needs at the same time. So people aren't necessarily only focusing on their physiological and safety needs. They may also be focusing on other higher level needs at the same time. So our brains are really complex mechanisms. We can do parallel processing. And if you think about it, during the day, you're trying to balance and deal with a whole bunch of your own needs and a whole bunch of other people's needs all at the same time. And the brain can do that, except when it can't. So let's talk about when it can't. So this is the parietal lobe, this purple thing here. The parietal lobe is part of the cerebral cortex, and this is the part of the brain that has spiritual experiences. And that doesn't necessarily mean religious. It also means like being inspired, feeling connected to something larger or part of something larger. But also enlightenment experiences, religious experiences, stuff like that. These things happen. Like, this is the part of the brain that lights up when people are having spiritual experiences. So purpose gets processed here, right? Purpose is the thing, the tool we use to be connected to something larger, to create fulfillment and meaning. So this is where purpose is happening in the brain. In a crisis, the part of the brain that's getting stimulated is the amygdala. The amygdala is these tiny two little things about the size of almonds on the front end of the hippocampus. And the amygdala, people think of it as a fear thing, and it is. But actually, more generally, what the amygdala does is it assigns positive or negative associations with experiences and memories. This is a good memory. This is a bad memory. This is a good experience. This is a bad experience, like that. And that includes, as part of that function, saying this is a bad experience because it's fearful, it's dangerous, it involves risk, and therefore I should be afraid of it. And so the amygdala is the part of the brain that decides whether a threat is sufficient that we should take action about it, right? And if the amygdala decides, oh, wow, this is a serious threat, this is a life-threatening threat, this is a major threat, then it has the capacity to shut off the cerebral cortex, to turn off the higher functions of the brain. And the purpose of this is in order to survive, right? So there's a lion in the room and you have to take immediate action about the lion. There's no time to think, no time to do anything other than act. This is the part of the brain that does that and gets you to jump, right? Jump out the window to avoid getting eaten by the lion. That's what this part of the brain does. If there's a lion in the room, that's really, really helpful. The problem is the brain does a very poor job at distinguishing between physical threats, emotional threats, financial threats, biological threats, etc. And so this part of the brain triggers when there's a different type of threat happening, like a threat to your job, for example, when jumping out the window isn't a very good strategy. And so when you trigger this part of the brain with a non-physical threat, The effect is that it makes the person stupid because they've just lost all of their strategic capability, which is all in the cerebral cortex, which just got shut down. And they lose their ability to feel part of something larger, to feel connected. The language processing is compromised. There's all this stuff going on in the cerebral cortex, and you become literally single-minded, right? The parallel processing feature of the brain is lost under these conditions. It becomes single-focused and only see things through a single lens. And you can think about this in a time when you've gone into a strong emotional reaction. Later, you can look back and say, wow, I was really kind of focused on only one aspect of the situation. But in that moment, while you're in that state, you are certain, you are right. It is true. There is no question. That's the amygdala override, right? That's the amygdala shutting off the cerebral cortex and making you single-minded to make it through the threat, even though that may not be the best idea. Okay, so I'm going to stop sharing the screen now. We can get back to our gallery view here. But if you want to see everybody, there's a little gallery view button up there if you don't want to just look at me. So that's how the brain works, right? So now if you think about what that means in terms of survival in a crisis that's not an immediate physical threat like a lion, that means that getting triggered, getting really fearful and having your amygdala kick in, excuse me, actually lowers your chances of survival. And I'll give you a specific example of this. So one of my past lives, I spent 23 years in the Navy and worked my way up from swabbing decks to being a commanding officer, which was a pretty long haul. And one of the things they taught us about was what to do if the ship sank and you wound up floating around in a lifeboat waiting to get rescued and hoping somebody would come get you. And one of the things they said that was a really important survival tool, they would always drill this into our heads, is to stay positive and stay optimistic. Now, that might be difficult if you're sitting around in a lifeboat with sharks circling and you have no idea when a ship is coming, but it's a really good idea. And if you think about it, they didn't say why, but if you think about it in terms of the amygdala, it makes perfect sense. If I were in a lifeboat and one person was running around saying, we're all gonna die, we're all gonna die, we're all gonna die, that person is a bigger threat than the sharks. Because if they can get everybody else sufficiently freaked out, everyone will get stupid and start doing dumb things like drinking all the water or throwing other people over the side or stuff like that in their sense of panic, feeling a need to take immediate action when really the best thing that we could all do for our survival is sit around, do nothing, and tell jokes. Like that would be the best way of surviving, right? Preferably dirty jokes under those conditions. Anything to keep everybody entertained. But that's not what the brain is going to tell you to do if you get freaked out. So if someone starts running around screaming, we're all going to die, you know, I might throw him overboard for the survival of the group, right? Or smack him or something, because that's the threat. The threat is getting everybody's amygdala triggered and making everybody stupid and panicked. So the trick then is that in a crisis like this one, which is a complex threat that requires a complex response, you have to stay positive. You have to stay optimistic so that you keep your cerebral cortex engaged and you're capable of long-term strategic thinking and not just making short-term fear-based decisions, right? Actually, another example of good short-term fear-based thinking is what happens in a market crash, right? People's amygdalas trigger and then people sell their stocks and lose all their retirement savings because they feel like they have to do something now because their amygdala is triggered, even though the smart move after the crash has already happened is to do nothing and wait, right? But they can't do that because their amygdala fired. Good. So now let's bring it back to purpose and a company, and the company's survival is threatened. What do we want to do? How do we use purpose? Well, is it possible for purpose to be used as a tool to keep people engaged in strategic thinking, to keep them optimistic, to keep them looking short-term and long-term? The answer is yes. Yes, it can be used in that way. You have to be careful though, because if you focus only on purpose and not on survival, you can wind up with pie in the sky solutions that don't bear any resemblance to the actual on the ground reality that's going on. And that's one of the concerns people have during leaders have during crisis, is say, well, we can't focus on purpose. That's going to result in this crazy kind of, woo-woo thinking. Maybe if you only focus on purpose, but if you focus on survival only, then you're going to get short-term fear-based stupid decisions that could threaten the survival of the company, and also, very importantly, alienate stakeholders, right? One of the pillars of conscious capitalism is stakeholder orientation. Well, if I'm in a panic mode, I'm not concerned about the effect of my decisions on other stakeholders. So I could alienate large groups of stakeholders that I've spent years cultivating relationships with, and that I may never be able to recover from that, right? I could destroy all sorts of long-term value in the organization by alienating stakeholder groups with my fear-driven short-term thinking. And let me give you an example of how this works. So one of the things that people use purpose for is to get higher loyalty from and higher engagement from employees. And that's a proper and correct use of purpose. Another thing people use purpose for is to get loyalty and more consideration from customers and prospective customers. That is also a proper and correct use of purpose. Well, in general, both the employees, if you're a leader in the organization, think of it this way: the employees and the customers are watching you because they always have a question in their mind. And the question is, are you really serious about this purpose thing? Or are you trying to blow smoke, right? Is this some trick? There's a term actually, purpose washing, that's now being used, similar to greenwashing, right? Where the marketing department comes up with the purpose and they do this big purpose promo, but the leaders don't actually have the purpose in their heart and they're not really serious about it. So the employees and the customers know that that's a thing, and they want to know. They want to know, are you serious or not? If at the first sign of a crisis you throw the purpose out the window, their conclusion then, correctly, is, oh, you're not that serious about the purpose. Good to know, right? Because I was starting to like you. And now you would have a lot of repair, and it might not be possible at that point, because once they've concluded that they have evidence that you're not serious, you may not be able to overcome that. It would be difficult, right? You'd have to go back and do a serious mea culpa and say, hey, we're so sorry, we panicked, we forgot about our purpose, please forgive us, right? It would be a lot of work to get back from that. Good. So because we want to include the purpose and keep the right parts of our brain working, but we don't want to ignore the survival situation, what does that look like to integrate the two? And that would involve asking questions like, how do we use our purpose to enhance our chances of survival? Like, what does our purpose tell us? Or what is our purpose? How does it inform us? What ideas can we get using the purpose as the basis that might be helpful for us to have a better shot at survival? And, right, stakeholder orientation, how can our purpose help other people in our ecosystem, other organizations, other stakeholders? How can we help them increase their chances of survival as well? Now, we don't want to do it in a way that costs us our survival, but if our purpose can help us help others in our ecosystem survive, good, let's do that too. That would be the opposite of the purpose washing, where it's like, oh, wow, they're using their purpose to help me. They're definitely serious about that purpose, right? And this is where part of the survival thing comes in, which aspects of our purpose maybe aren't relevant right now under these conditions and we need to pause and put on hold. Because we may be limited in what we can do with our purpose by the current environment. It's a perfectly reasonable thing to do to say, gonna have to wait on this, gonna have to wait on that, because our survival is on the line. But we can still do this, this, and this with our purpose. That's perfectly reasonable. And if you explain that, the stakeholders will understand. We'll talk about that more in a minute. By the way, if questions are coming up, go ahead and put them in the chat now, and we can get to them when we're done, because we're gonna do a little Q&A after this. So I'd be delighted if you were already thinking ahead about questions. Good. Let me say a little bit more about what I was just saying, which is sometimes in a crisis, you have to do something that's not purposeful in order to survive, that's not aligned with the purpose. And that's just the reality. Or you may have to put certain things on hold relative to the purpose because of the crisis. My very strong recommendation in that situation is to be really forthright and transparent about that. if you explain to the employees or the customers or whichever stakeholders and say, hey, our purpose would tell us to do this, but because of current circumstances, we really can't. Or in order to survive, we have to do this thing, which granted is not super purposeful, but that's what it's going to take for us to be here in a year. If you're that transparent about it, generally they'll understand. A few of them might complain, but if you treat the stakeholders like adults and say, this is the situation, put yourself in our shoes, see what you would come up with, generally they'll go, okay, yeah, I get that. And then if later, when circumstances change, you say, remember that thing we put on hold or we had to do this, whatever? Okay, now we don't have to anymore. Things are better now. You won't incur, in my experience, a big negative hit from behaving that way. The thing that will cause the negative hit is if you have to do something that's not purposeful and you try to spin it and make it sound as if it is. That's the thing that will piss people off, because they'll know that you're lying, right? When you're spinning something like that, they know you're spinning it. And that then makes them suspicious. So if you have to behave that way, just be really super transparent about it. Good. There's another feature of purpose that's really, really helpful in a crisis. And that is if it's a really accurate purpose, if it's highly precise and really inspiring, then it can be used as a navigational tool in the crisis. And particularly if it's a purpose that's been derived using intuitive means rather than logical and rational means, then it tends to have this feature. And that is one of the tests we use at the True Purpose Institute to tell whether a purpose is accurate is if you start behaving purposefully, then weird stuff starts to happen in your favor. It's called synchronicity. It's a phenomenon that Carl Jung first described. And that's a predictable side effect of behaving purposefully. It happens really consistently. So if you have an accurate purpose and you're using that purpose in a crisis and behaving according to that purpose, what will tend to happen is luck will favor you. Things will tend to go your way. And in fact, if you've been using that purpose for a while, when you get into the crisis, it will look as if you've planned for it. It's a very strange phenomenon, but it's very, very consistent. And so right now, as an example, none of my purpose clients, the organizations that I've been working with on their purpose, not one of them has complained that they've taken a significant negative financial hit from the crisis. My organization, for example, shift to almost exclusively online stuff over the course of the past few years. Did we know a pandemic was coming? Absolutely not. But if you're behaving according to your purpose, it looks like you were planning ahead. So purpose actually turns out to be a really good navigational tool to use during a crisis. It will tend to give you better answers to strategic questions than logic will. And in fact, I have another really good example of this. I was working, this was before the last crisis back in 2008. I was working with several executives at ING Investment on their individual purpose. And I also worked with the executive team of which they were a part. And this was in the spring of 2007. And we did a 2-day retreat. And at the end of the retreat, they were able to predict almost exactly how the economic crisis of 2008 was going to play out. I remember listening to the CEO explaining in detail how it was going to bleed over from this into this, into this, into this sector. It was really uncanny. So there's this interesting, weird forethought aspect to purpose that you can take advantage of as well. And it's actually, and there's one other benefit to it, which is if you're passionate about your purpose, if you're passionate about the organization's purpose, that means that you'll be more committed to the organization's survival. And this goes for people at any part of the organization and even external stakeholders as well. And to this point, I was working with the purpose of a high-tech startup in Israel, and we were about to launch a project to find their higher purpose. And we invited, or I invited one of the VCs that was funding this company to come speak to the company about the importance of purpose. And he stood there in front of the team, the executive team of the organization, and said that when they were looking for organizations to invest in as venture capitalists, they wanted the organizations and the leaders who had a clear purpose and could say what it was. And the reason was that that meant that they could trust that that leader in that organization would stick with it when things got tough and figure out a way through, because that purpose would make them more passionate and more committed to the survival of the company. A good example of this is another high-tech startup I worked with also in Israel. They found their purpose. They had 1,200% growth over the next 3 years as a direct result of finding their higher purpose. Their revenue had been flat for like 8 years before that. And then after several years of explosive growth, they lost a key customer that was responsible for a huge amount of their revenue, which put them in a very, very tough position financially. And the employees of the organization volunteered to work for the company for months for free to help the company survive. They had participated in finding its purpose. They loved the purpose. They loved the company. They wanted the company to make it. And as a result of those employees' sacrifice, that organization did make it. And it recently got sold. So it got back on its feet and got back together financially and just recently had their exit event. And that's an interesting question, right? Is how many people would work for your company for free because they love the purpose so much? I have people who work for my company for free because they love the purpose so much. And the most extreme example that I can think of purpose in a crisis is Viktor Frankl in Man's Search for Meaning, writing about his experience in the Nazi concentration camps. He said, he was a psychiatrist and he was observing what was going on around him and said very specifically that it was not the strongest people who survived. It was not the smartest people who survived. It was not the leaders who survived. It was the ones who had a sense of purpose. And so I would argue, based even on that piece of information alone, that you could think of purpose as the ultimate survival tool, right? If you could take one thing in your toolkit with you in a crisis, maybe it's purpose. Good. So that's the presentation portion. Hope you found it informative and inspiring. And I would be love to entertain questions in the chat. By the way, also if you press the participants button, there's also a raise hand feature. And if you raise your hand, then you can ask your question out loud rather than doing it in the chat. So let's see, we've got some, this is a pretty long one. Let's start with this one. How does analysis paralysis play into neuroscience? What impact does it have to take too long to make a decision about what to do or not? So the neuroscience on analysis paralysis would be the freeze response, right? When I was young, it was fight or flight. And it got updated a few years ago to be fight, flight, and freeze as fear responses. So you can see that sometimes in leaders where they panic and then won't make a decision. That's a freeze response. And that can be absolutely devastating. That can be fatal to an organization to refuse to make a decision in circumstances that really call for a decision. And under really extreme circumstances, a bad decision may be better than no decision, potentially. Let's see, retail has been hit hard financially. Yes, it certainly has. In this instance, even though there's been a clear purpose at the top, people all employers are committed to, the company is taking a hit financially. Absolutely, it still happens. Even though they are not acting according to purpose, it has not had a positive. So even though they are acting according to purpose, it has not had a positive outcome. Any thoughts about how the financial piece will come back? So let me say that purpose is by no means a guarantee of survival, right? You could be in the lifeboat and be optimistic and still eventually sink and get eaten by sharks. Purpose is not a panacea. So having 0 customers and a higher purpose does not equate to revenue. So something like retail, obviously none of my customers, none of my clients who I'm saying haven't been that financially affected, they are not, storefront retail clients, or they would be severely negatively impacted by the current financial crisis. So yeah, absolutely, purpose by itself is not an answer. But I would say you could still look to the purpose and ask, does the purpose tell us anything useful about how to plan, how to move forward, and how to survive? And I think that's a fair question. When we get into small groups later, that's the question I'm going to ask you to ask yourself and one another. Let's see, here's a technical question from someone who's obviously done the true purpose process. It says, I appreciate connecting with my trusted sources by journaling for some years. So what this person is talking about, a trusted source, I was talking about intuitive methods. The techniques that we use at the True Purpose Institute involve directly connecting to the unconscious and seeking to have the purpose just kind of told to you rather than trying to figure out what it is. And this person has obviously done that process and with me and is referring to that. So are there other ways of doing it? So I don't want to spend a lot of time on this because most people aren't familiar with the true purpose process, but another one you can do if you've been journaling for years is you can just try asking questions in your mind and listening for answers. And if you've been journaling for several years, as you have, that will probably just start working. If not, you need to go back and do some permission work. Difference between organizational purpose and mission. Is purpose a higher force to galvanize a team in a crisis? Yeah, good. So let's get into definitions a little bit. So mission has more than one meaning. I've heard some consultants use mission or vision meaning the reverse of one another. So to me, the way I was trained in organization development consulting, a vision is a picture of the future. This is the future we're trying to create. That's what a vision is. Could be the company we're trying to create, could be the world we're trying to create, could be the you that you're trying to evolve into. That's a vision, right? So that's a detailed description of some desired future. A mission can mean one of two things, depending on whether you're talking about a for-profit company or a nonprofit, an NGO, okay? So a typical for-profit company mission sounds something like, we produce truck tires of the highest quality for the transportation industry, or we deliver excellent divorce legal services to high net worth couples, okay? Something like that. That's what a typical for-profit company mission sounds like. And what they're describing is what the core business is, right? This is the thing that we do, and this is who we do it for, okay? If you go to the nonprofit world, the mission sounds very different. The mission is save the whales or feed the starving children or end climate change or create a peaceful world or something like that. That's a very different sort of mission. And from a conscious capitalism perspective, I would say that's the kind of mission we're talking about, not the first kind. The first kind's useful, but that's not the inspiring, galvanizing, motivating purpose that's going to cause the employees to work harder to make sure the company survives, right? But the second kind is. So the mission in the True Purpose Institute language is a goal. It's a way of changing the world. Now, it doesn't have to be the whole world. It could be create peace in the Middle East, right? Or end gang violence in US cities or something like that. But it has an end point, right? Once the whales are saved, mission complete. And that's a type of purpose statement. It's not the only type of purpose statement. There are other types of purpose statements. But if you're using the nonprofit version, that's a perfectly valid way of constructing a purpose. And the way I would say it is a purpose is the answer to the question, why are we here in the case of a company, or why am I here in the case of an individual? And saying we are here to save the whales, that's a valid answer, right? We are here to provide legal services is also sort of a valid answer, but not really. That's more of a what we do, not why we do it. Good, great question. Fight, flight, freeze, fawn, cower, placate. Actually, if you want to go all the way with the fear responses, I heard it's fight, flight, freeze, flock, meaning gather together in groups, or fold, give up. Right? I recently heard that that's the full set. Fight, flight, freeze, flock, and fold. But I'm good with fight, flight, freeze. I don't need the other two. How do you spark enthusiasm and buy-in for a purpose with a team member who joins after the purpose is set? Great question. Two answers. So we do a whole company process to find our purpose, and now we hire somebody. Okay. Well, they weren't there when we found the purpose. How do we help them get on board with the purpose? Two ways. One way, screen during the hiring process. Very important. While we're doing the hiring, we have the new hire sit in front of, if you're the hiring manager or the HR person or something like that, and you say, well, one thing you should know about our company is this is our purpose. And then you tell them the purpose, and now you watch, right? What happens? What you want to see is eyebrows go up, noise, oh, right? And then questions. If you get that response, that's good. Okay, we're looking for some kind of reaction from the person. If they go, uh-huh, good. And so next week we'll da-da-da, not so good, right? We want someone who actually has an emotional reaction to the purpose. That's a sign that they will be able to connect to it and get behind it. That's one way. And another way, actually, there's another thing you can do in hiring, which is ask the person what their purpose or vision or values or whatever is. What do they use to guide their long-term decision making? And if they can answer the question any way at all, like 20 years from now, I want to be, the Olympic winner of blah, 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 or I love to help, homeless people and I volunteer in a soup kitchen and that's what really moves me. As long as they can answer the question, it's fine. If they can't answer the question, that's a bad sign. That means that they're going to have trouble being motivated by your purpose because they're not motivated by something similar in themselves. So that's two things you can do during hiring. After the person's already on board, the advanced technique is to give them an opportunity to influence the purpose, meaning modify it. So I've done this with organizations where, so we find the purpose, a year later, we say, okay, let's check and make sure this purpose is still good. And we get everybody back together and say, can anyone think of a better, more powerful statement than this one? And that includes all the people who've been hired since then, including the person who just showed up for work that day. Okay. And now everybody has a chance to put alternatives up there and we test them to see which one's strongest and most accurate. We have ways of doing that. And maybe the new hire's purpose is the one that won, right? And interestingly, even if the purpose doesn't change, the fact that everyone got an opportunity to influence it causes them to buy in. Whether they were able to change, even if they volunteered an alternative and it lost, the fact that they had the possibility of influencing the purpose results in them buying in. Great question. Does the purpose of a company evolve over time? Yes. Now you could say, well, the purpose doesn't evolve, but the purpose statements do. Or you could say the purpose evolves and therefore the purpose statements do. I don't care which one you believe in. But in practice, you have to update the purpose every year or two. Because if you don't, the power, the motivational power of it will decrease over time. It'll get stale. So you do need to change the purpose from time to time. Let's see. Is it important to seek alignment between personal purpose and organizational purpose? Yes. So a lot of companies are working to find the purpose of individuals in the organization for two reasons. One is purpose-driven employees are better employees. They work harder, they're more loyal, they have fewer lost sick days, they have lower turnover, they're more productive. It's just a long, long, long list of things that's true about purpose-driven employees. That's basically the whole wish list of what an employer would want in an employee. And lots of research showing this. It's about a third of people who are purpose-driven. So you want individuals who have a purpose, period. Like that's really good for business. Now, if you want the company to grow on steroids, like that 1,200% in 3 years I was talking about before, you want employees who know their purpose, an organization that knows its purpose, and the employees can see the connection between their individual purpose, the organization's purpose, and their job, their role. If they can connect all three of those, they will be unbelievably motivated. You actually have to tell them to go home. Go home to your family. No, now, right? Because it's so engaging and so inspiring for them when all of that is connected, right? So now they're coming to work to create a better world. And they get paid too. It's great, right? That's a whole meaning bonus, which is actually much more motivating than a financial bonus, and research shows. So it's very important. But most organizations don't know their organizational purpose, and most employees don't know theirs, which means that's a project, right? You have to create an organizational capacity to find individuals' purpose, and you have to create an organizational project to find the organization's purpose, and then you have to go around testing for alignment. And you have to be nice to people if it's not aligned. You can't just like show them the door, right? If their purposes isn't aligned, you have to work with them to figure out what to do about that. You can't just say, oh, sorry, don't let your door hit you in the back on the way out, right? You comment about a precise purpose. What do you mean by precise? What I mean is that anyone can come up with a purpose, but that doesn't mean that it's really accurate. And there are different ways of measuring the accuracy of a purpose. Now, it's not super quantifiable, but it is definitely testable. And we have, in the methodology we use, we have 9 different tests for telling whether a purpose is accurate or not. And an accurate purpose tends to be a little bit longer than a vague one, right? It's easy to make a vague purpose like our purpose is to help people, or our purpose is to create a better world, right? Or our purpose is to be a role model or something like that. And many purpose processes yield very short, simple, vague purpose statements like that. That can be useful and it can be motivating, but a more precise purpose, let me think of a good example. Let's see. Our mission is to transform the gas and oil industry. That's a recent one I found. That's actually the case study I talked about last week in my certification presentation. So that was a Dutch company that sells valves to the oil and gas industry. So that's much, much, much more precise and more accurate and therefore more motivating to them. So what I like to see in a really precise purpose is it's got some detail in it, usually 4 to 5 sentences long, not one. And when the employees read the purpose out loud, they start to choke or cry. To me, that's a really precise purpose, right? And that would be a good question to ask yourself. Has anyone ever cried from reading your company mission statement out loud? Probably not if you're like most companies, which means that it has low motivational potential. That is, it's not generating strong emotional reactions, and therefore people aren't likely to change their behavior because of that statement, right? In order to cause people to change their behavior, the statement has to have an emotional impact because people make decisions with emotion and justify them with logic. So a logical purpose statement will buy you nothing. Great question. Let's see. If you just, someone's asking about Maslow in the later part of his life. If you just poke around on the web, Maslow's hierarchy of needs, some of the later ones that were proposed, the self-transcendence level was proposed. There's another one, an aesthetic level, a learning level were also proposed. So if you just search Maslow, self-transcendence, aesthetic, learning, this kind of stuff, you'll find resources that explain all these other levels of Maslow's hierarchy. Pretty easy to find. It's my understanding that the amygdala is the primitive portion of our brain. It's not possible to strategically deal with it. Not possible is a strong word. You can actually influence the readiness with which the amygdala triggers. And that's actually what post-traumatic stress disorder is, right? So you can behaviorally change how easy it is to trigger somebody's amygdala. So someone who's been under extreme stress, like in a war zone for several years, you remove them from the war zone and their amygdala is still on a hair trigger, right? And every time a truck backfires, they drive under the table and start grabbing for knives and stuff. That's because their triggering level of their amygdala has been lowered by experiences. You can also raise it. And the way you do that is by things like meditation. So monks who meditate, 8 hours a day or something in Tibet, they've done studies on their brains. Their brains function very differently around stress than yours and mine do. Now, I don't do enough, I don't do that much meditation. I don't meditate 8 hours a day. I know people who do. But there's other ways of doing it as well. You can absolutely influence how your brain functions. Another way of doing it, by the way, is dealing with your core wounds from childhood psychologically, because those actually provide lots of triggering opportunities in situations that aren't actually threatening, because something reminds you of something that happened to you when you were 5 or 6 years old, and it doesn't even need to be conscious. So it is actually possible to change the threshold of triggering, or which situations are more or less likely to trigger your amygdala. Let's see, when you work with a company, do you include staff employees in purpose development or just C-suite? So I advocate for including everyone in the purpose discovery process. I'm going to take 1 or 2 more questions because I want you guys to have time in small groups. It's common for just the CEO or a small group of leaders to go off on a retreat, come up with a purpose, and come back and announce it. Now, that's efficient in the sense of getting to the answer, here's the purpose, but it's actually not that efficient in terms of manifesting and integrating the purpose into the organization. And the reason is when that small group of people come back to the company, they now have to sell that purpose to all the other stakeholders. And that's actually a very big, time-consuming, challenging process. And that whole process can be just completely obviated and made unnecessary by inviting everyone to go on the retreat and find the purpose with them. And I don't care how many people there are, you can involve thousands or tens of thousands of people in finding an organization's purpose using technology. It's not that hard. And I know cases where it's been done really effectively. So what you do in that case is now you involve everyone who wants to be involved from amongst the employees. And now when you have the answer, everyone who participated is a salesperson for that purpose. And it becomes much, much, much faster and easier to get that purpose distributed in the organization than if you only took 5 or 10 or 20 people on the offsite, right? The other best practice is to include other stakeholder groups besides the employees, right? This is a mixture of the purpose pillar and the stakeholder orientation pillar of conscious capitalism, where now you invite key customers, donors, owners, funders, stockholders, right? Partner organizations in the supply chain, and invite them to participate in finding or updating the organization's higher purpose. And the reason you do this is that anyone who's in the room when you find the company's purpose will fall in love with the purpose. And anyone who falls in love with the purpose will fall in love with the company. And so when the CEO says to me, well, Tim, I just want to take my executive team, I say, okay, I just offered you unlimited potions of a love potion, unlimited doses, and you want to give those unlimited doses of that love potion to 8 people, not to 10,000. Why? Why don't you want everyone to love your company? Why do you only want 8 people to love your company? It takes a little more time to, not that much more, it takes a little more time to involve a large number of people, not as much as you'd think. But the time saved in selling the purpose is enormous. Good. 4 types of purpose statements. Oh, unfortunately, if I go into that, we won't have any time for small groups. I've already spent more time than I want. Tell you what, let me put my email here because some of you have excellent questions that I'm not going to get a chance to answer. timk@transcendentsolutions.com. Okay, there's my email address. Take that email address and your excellent question that you've asked that I haven't answered and email it to me and I will respond. It might take me a few days. But I think we're getting really excellent questions here and I'd hate to leave them unanswered. So what I'd like to do now, and Michael, I'd like your help with this, is I want to transition to small groups. And what I want you to be talking about in the small group is how can my purpose or how can our company purpose help in the current situation, right? This is a parietal lobe and frontal lobe collaboration project to try to make meaning of the purpose and meaning of the current crisis and use that to come up with strategies you wouldn't otherwise have thought of, which you may or may not choose to implement. That's not the point, right? This is a form of brainstorming, right? Using the purpose as a seed to try to grow new strategies you hadn't already thought about. Now, if you have no idea what your individual purpose is, or you have no idea what your organization's purpose is, this may prove difficult, in which case I would advocate you defer to someone else. And so if you're not the working partner, right, they have the working partner say, well, here's how the crisis is affecting me or you could either do it personally or as an organization, either way, right? If you're a solo consultant, maybe it makes sense to do it just for yourself. Here's my situation or here's our situation. Here's my purpose or our purpose. Here's some ideas I have about how that purpose could help us. Group, what ideas do you have about how that purpose could help us under these circumstances? And write down what everybody says and don't argue with them, right? If you don't like the idea, thank them, write it down, and then throw it away later. But this is brainstorming, which means no criticism of people's ideas, right? Good. And if you don't want to stay for the small groups, that's okay. You can go do something else. And we'll reconvene briefly at the end in about 10 minutes. Good. So you'll really have time for one person to do it thoroughly, or maybe 2 if you're fast. Okay, Michael, can you break us up into like groups of 4 or 5? And I'll be floating around, so you may have a chance to, get some help from me.
Okay, looks like we have everybody else rejoining.
Welcome back. All right, so I hope you got some good stuff out of that session. There's a fascinating conversation going on in my little group. I was planning on going to other groups, but I got sucked in. So if you have more things to say, I mean, we have to wrap up now because we're at the top of the hour. If you have more things to say, more things to ask, got my email in the chat, copy it, because once this session is over, it's going to disappear. And back over to you, Amanda. Thanks so much for having me.
Great. Thank you so much, Tim. And I think that that was a really fantastic presentation. I really appreciate you sharing your email address with folks because there certainly were some fantastic questions still open there. And I'm seeing in the chat box, the best way to communicate with folks in the conference is to actually go to the community Slack channel. So maybe Michael can share that for us in the chat box and you can connect with other participants there. And Tim graciously shared his email as the presenter today. So Tim, once again, thank you for a phenomenal presentation. Looking forward to lots more as one of our newest certified consultants for conscious capitalism. And as a reminder, we'll be back here tomorrow for a special session since it's the 50th anniversary of Earth Day with Aaron Mizan from Interface with an amazing story about the sustainability journey that Interface has been on. Thanks so much for your participation and sharing your voices, and we will see you again tomorrow. Have a good night, everybody.
Thanks,
Bye.
everybody. Bye-bye.